In the first chapter on violence, Fanon establishes the violent nature of decolonization. Inherent in decolonization is the total overhaul of a system that is repressive and brutal. It is the encounter between two congenitally antagonistic forces. Fanon establishes that the highlight of decolonization is the creation of new men. This process thoroughly challenges the colonial situation. He describes it as the last being the first. The determination of the colonized to smash every obstacle in their way of decolonization is key, and every method will be employed against it, including violence. He mentions that the colonized have been prepared for violence all their lives by the very nature of colonization and every institution that props it up. The colonized world is divided into two. On one side are the police officers, soldiers, spokesmen of the oppressive institution of colonization. This side never hesitates to use violence and the language of violence to show total domination of the colonized. Then on the native sector or the colonized sector, we have this side that is in constant confrontation with the colonists sector. He draws the confrontation and the constant antagonism between them in the standard of living, paved roads, clean streets, and a belly full of good things. This side is the side of the colonizer, which is a white sector. The colonized or the native sector lives from hand to mouth in shanty towns where you can die from anything at anywhere. This sector is hungry for bread, it has no shoes, and it is the sector of niggers, black people. This stark difference makes the colonized look at the colonizer with envy and wanting to take his place. And the colonizer knows this. This is why he, the colonizer, is always on guard. The race one belongs to is a clearly differentiating feature for those that suffer and those that do not. You are rich because you are white, and you are white because you're rich. Fanon highlights that the Marxist analysis must be stretched a bit further when it comes to addressing colonial issues. The character of pre-capitalist society with the knight and serf, which needed the reference to define rights, is different from outright domination of the colonized with weapons and force. The main differentiating feature here is race. He mentions that the colonized, when ready to take history into his own hands, will appropriate the same violence with which the colonizer employed in deracinating and destroying his economic, cultural lifestyle. Fanon quotes, "To dislocate the colonial world does not mean that once the borders have been eliminated, there will be a right of way between the two sectors. To destroy the colonial world means nothing less than demolishing the colonist sector, burying it deep within the earth, or banishing it from the territory." The colonizer portrays the colonized society as barbaric and evil, devoid of values and traditions. He dehumanizes the colonized, likening them to animals. But the colonized, on hearing this dehumanization, mocks these comparisons and prepares his mind for battle with the colonizer. The colonized is appealed upon to be reasonable when it is time for decolonization. The colonized intellectuals that have links with the people try to form a link and go for opportunism, middle groundism, but it is obvious that to the colonized, decolonization is the only way forward. And Fanon quotes, For the colonized people, the most essential value, the most meaningful is the land. The colonized discovers their humanity, that is, breathing and the heartbeats are the same as that of the colonists. Everything that mentally subjugates him is cast away and makes the confrontation even more decisive in the period of decolonization. In the conditions where decolonization struggle has rocked society to the core and the intellectuals find themselves among the people, shedding their blood together in the struggle, individualism dies, unity of action takes over, self-criticism also resurfaces. The national political parties that are not radical or that do not want to overthrow the system surfaces, and we have a national bourgeoisie and the colonized intellectuals. The colonized will extend their own aggressiveness towards their own people at first, which is a horizontal aggression and the built-up tension. The head in the sand behavior is peculiar to the colonized at a collective level. We have tribal feuds, religion and fatalism, handing over everything to God, coming up with myths and taboos. Mysticism takes over. After going on a long trip of indulging in escapism through myths and spiritual rituals during the struggle for liberation, the colonized loses interest in all these things and confronts the material reality, which is the only force that challenges his being, colonialism. Nationalist parties, pacifists, asking for more power from the colonizers, they act as the agents of stabilizers of oppression and they keep the system going. The petty bourgeoisie, traders, shopkeepers, elementary school teachers, all looking out for their own selfish interest and gains. There is the colonized intellectual who wishes to be assimilated to the colonizer's world. And then we have the peasantry, the only revolutionary class that is largely ignored in the proclamations of the intellectual and nationalist parties. It is obvious, Fanon quotes, that the peasantry only is revolutionary. This underprivileged and serving peasant is the exploited who soon discovers that only violence pays. For him, there is no compromise and no possibility of concession. The approach of non-violence highlights the middle ground between the colonized intellectual and business elites and the colonizers. Compromise is a tool that involves the colonial system and the burgeoning national bourgeoisie. This also is an agenda by the national bourgeoisie who are unable to foresee the consequences of a mass uprising or revolutionary action because they fear that they will also be swept away by the action. They claim they have nothing to do with revolutionary movements but quickly act as mediators between the people and colonialism. The nationalist bourgeoisie distances themselves from the people's struggles and are preoccupied by objectivity in the face of oppression. They see the attempts to smash colonial domination by force as suicide on the path of the oppressed, simply because of superior firepower, tanks, bombs, and the level of violence, which is on the surface a huge threat. But the changing nature of warfare in the face of oppression, we'll have things like guerrilla warfare, has opened new scopes in battle. Colonies have been dominated and have morphed into sources of raw materials and markets. So it's not fully in the interest of the colonizers to have any action that would disrupt business. He quotes, "The monopolist fraction of the metropolitan bourgeoisie and industrialists do not expect a devastation of the colonial population, but the protection of their legitimate interests. using economic agreements. They also have to deal with the political and diplomatic aid from progressive countries and their peoples. They also have to deal with internal contradictions within the same monopolistic system and tussle between their own capitalist cartels. Fanon states that the scorched earth policy has been replaced by economic dependency. All this gives room for reformists, nationalist bourgeoisie to put some pressure on colonial authorities, and sometimes a national leader arises from negotiation with the colonists, but the mode of operations and relations between oppressor and oppressed continues and do not change. This leads to empty independence and a very vague national framework. Fanon then focuses on the militant revolutionary that might have broken away from the nationalist parties. Most times they are antagonized and hated, and he finds his way back to the peasantry, these revolutionary militants. He reconnects with them and other revolutionary movements, and the defeat of the colonizers all around the world brings up hope. We have examples of Dien Bien Phu in Vietnam, which serves as source of motivation, and the people are eager to reenact such victories in their homelands. The violence continues, and this unsettles both the bourgeoisie, nationalist parties, and the colonists. The continued violence and repression of the people further makes them more resolute and confirms that force is the only solution. The contradiction in the colonist countries also forces them to cave into the demands of the colonized. For example, when England or any of these countries keep spending money on military domination, it starves the working class at home. So these are the contradictions. With independence gotten on the wrong foundation, the colonized finds out quickly that things really didn't change. And on top of that, the new countries that have just gotten their independence are in the world of the Cold War, capitalism versus socialism. Internal instability plagues their young nations, and this country spends a whole lot of the capital that they don't have on border defense. And all this global action of violence and imperialistic maneuvers makes the colonized man politically aware. Fanon points out that although independence has brought the colonized people moral reparation and dignity, they haven't had time to elaborate on a society and build on values. So the neutrality of the new nations is empty, and a caricature of internationalism becomes a major character of new nations. Back to the violence and what the colonized makes of it. These very same people who had it constantly drummed into them that the only language they understood was that of force, now decide to express themselves with force. In fact, the colonists has always shown them the path they should follow to liberation. The argument chosen by the colonized was conveyed to them by the colonists, and by an ironic twist of fate, it is now the colonized who states that the colonizer is one who do not understand anything but that of force. Fanon states that the arrival of the colonists signifies the death of indigenous society, cultural lethargy, and petrification of the individual. For the colonized, life can only materialize from the rotting cadaver of the colonists. Such then is the term-for-term correspondence between the two arguments. But it also happens that on the psyche of the oppressed and colonized, violence is invested with positive formative features because it constitutes their only work towards realizing themselves, and it is a almighty unifying factor that mobilizes the people, pitches them in a single direction from which there is no turning back. It unifies the people and makes them leaders. On the individual level, violence is a cleansing force. It rids the colonized of their inferiority complex, of their passiveness and their despairing attitude. It emboldens them and restores their self-confidence. On violence in the international context, Fanon expresses that there is enormous pressure on newly liberated nations because of the level of underdevelopment. The leaders try to mobilize the people on numerous fronts to catch up with other nations. In fact, this is based on the belief and erroneous understanding that European nations have reached their present stage of development as a result of their labors. Fanon corrects this by reminding us that the development of capitalism in national European bourgeoisie was what facilitated this so-called development and expansion via imperialism to the dismantling of indigenous communities and societies, nations in Africa, Asia. Fanon says that European opulence is literally a scandal, for it was built on the backs of slaves. It fed on the bloods of slaves and owes its very existence to the soil and subsoil of the underdeveloped world. Europe's well-being and progress were built with the sweat and corpses of black, Arabs, Indians, and Asians. This we are determined never to forget. So, when a colonized people ask for independence, the colonial apparatus with its coercive powers tell the young African nations, if you want independence, take it and suffer the consequences. This means that they are trying to send these new countries or these new nations back into the dark ages with their coercive powers and the international strength that they've garnered over centuries of exploitation and military power. And this puts immense pressure on these nations. Some other countries go with the terms of the colonizers and maintain existing structures that the colonizers have put in place. Hence, they become dependent on the colonizers. And Fanon emphasizes that the capitalist way of development is incapable of bringing any tangible results to underdeveloped countries, since it is based on monopolies and cartels and by and large for exploitation and extraction. On the other hand, he affirms that the socialist path of development gives the chance for material and cultural development of underdeveloped countries, and that the mode of production must be upgraded and all colonial methods of operation must be uprooted and a new chart or new pathway must be forged by these countries. Fanon establishes that the colonizers must also pay reparations, and he says that moral reparations for national independence does not feed or fool the young nations. Quoting Fanon, he says that the wealth of imperialist nations is also our wealth. At a universal level, such a statement in no way means we feel implicated in the technical feats or artistic creations of the West. In concrete terms, Europe has been bloated out of all proportions by the gold and raw materials from such colonial countries as Latin America, China, and Africa. Today, Europe's tower of opulence faces these continents for centuries. The point of departure of their shipments of diamond, oil, silk, and cotton, timber, and exotic produce to this very same Europe. Europe is literally the creation of the third world. The riches which are choking it are those plundered from the underdeveloped peoples. The ports of Holland, the docks in Bordeaux and Liverpool owe their importance to the trade and deportation of millions of slaves, And when we hear the head of a European nation declare with hand on heart that it must come to the aid of unfortunate peoples of the underdeveloped world, we do not tremble with gratitude. On the contrary, we say amongst ourselves, it is just reparation we are getting. So we will not accept aid for the underdeveloped countries as charity. Such aid must be considered the final stage of a dual consciousness, the consciousness of the colonized that it is their due, and the consciousness of the capitalist powers that effectively they must pay up. Fanon goes ahead to say that if due to ingratitude or lack of intelligence, the capitalist countries refuse to pay up, the contradictions of stagnant capital, of their own system, capitalism, would affect them, and that the bloating of capital in the metropoles would choke these countries. It will affect the working class as the capital isn't invested at home and has no outlets abroad. And the third world nations that have been damaged by the policies of imperialism also react to this abandonment by creating an autarky. They close up and do not allow anything or any product from the West to come into their country. And this creates a crisis back home for the capitalist countries and the working class, as there will be factory closures, layoffs, unemployment. These things become the order of the day. In this contradiction, Fanon reaffirms that the third world nations are powerful in their own right. Fanon ends the chapter by explaining that the Cold War mentality would get the world nowhere, and that progressive humanity, including the European masses and underclass, would have to wake up in the spirit of class consciousness to combat our common enemies, the ruling class. This ruling class that has brought about the backwardness of the world and the third world specifically.